Hey everybody, great to have you today. This is our first time with our AI expert, Alex Rivera, APN, SASE, and ZTNA expert. And today we're talking about goodbye private APNs, talking about something most people never think about, the private lanes your data takes over 4G and 5G, and why the old model may be holding you back. Today, my guest is the AI expert, Alex Rivera, a veteran of carrier-grade mobile networks, who now designs ZTNA and SASE architectures for fleet, IoT, and remote workers generated by an AI prompt. Alex, great to have you on.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And hey, everyone listening, it's a pleasure to be here. So yeah, let's dive in. A lot of folks never really think about these private lanes, these private APNs that have been the backbone for how enterprise data gets around in the mobile world. And now we're talking about moving on to something a bit more flexible and identity driven with SASE and ZTNA. So it's going to be a fun chat.
Hey, Alex, for people who've never heard of the term private APN, what's the simplest way you'd explain it to an executive?
Sure thing. So for an executive, I'd put it like this. A private APN is basically your own dedicated lane on the mobile network. It's like having a reserved, secure highway that all your company's mobile data travels on. Traditionally, you'd hand out SIM cards that connect to that private lane, and all the traffic would route back to your data center or cloud where you control everything. So it's a familiar concept, your own private network bubble. And the big shift we're talking about today is moving from that kind of setup to something that's more flexible and identity-based, which is where ZTNA and SASE come in.
Walk us through a classic private APN setup. Let's say I've got a fleet of routers on 4G, 5G. That fleet could be thousands, right? Stoplights, cameras. But what actually happens to those packets from the SIM to the data center?
Absolutely. So let's walk through it in plain terms. Imagine you've got thousands of those routers out there. Maybe they're in traffic lights, maybe they're in IoT devices, whatever it is. Each router has a SIM card that's programmed to connect to your private APN. What happens is when that SIM goes live, it attaches to the mobile network, just like any other SIM. But because it's tied to your private APN, the mobile core network, so we're talking the PGW or the UPF in a 5G world, recognizes that this traffic needs to go into a specific virtual route or a private tunnel that leads back to your enterprise. So those packets are essentially a funnel through the carrier's core network, kept in private, isolated paths, and then handed off to your data center or cloud environment. Once it's there, it's like any other traffic you'd handle on your own network.
What are the selling points? Like the teams usually like about APNs?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the big selling points of APNs is that sense of control and predictability. Teams love that they have a dedicated lane that they can manage. It's familiar, it's stable, and you know exactly where your traffic is going. Plus, for a lot of legacy setups, think IoT fleets, kiosks, and so on, an APN is a known quantity. It just works. You've got your TIMs, your static IPs, and your traffic goes back to a central place you control. So it's that sense of reliability and a bit of a comfort zone. It's a solid, if somewhat traditional way of doing things, and that's what teams often appreciate about it.
Where does it start to hurt? Give me your top 3 pain points you continue to see out there.
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk about where the cracks start to show. I'd say the first big pain point is scalability. As you add more devices, more locations, and more complexity, managing all those SIMs, private IPs, and tunnels can turn into a real headache. You start dealing with overlapping address spaces, you run into NAT issues, and it just doesn't scale cleanly when you're dealing with thousands of endpoints. Second pain point is flexibility. If you want to move to a more dynamic cloud-centric model, private APNs can feel pretty rigid. Everything's tied back to a central hub, so you lose the agility of just letting devices securely access resources from anywhere without hauling all traffic back to one place. And the third is visibility and policy management. With a private APN, your policies are often tied to IP addresses and network segments. That can lead to a lot of static ACLs and firewall rules that are a pain to update. When you move to an identity-based model like ZTNA, you get to define policies based on who the user or device is rather than where they're coming from, and that just makes life a lot easier. So those are the big 3: scalability, flexibility, and the complexity of policy management.
Can you give an example where APN looked great on paper, but turned into a troubleshooting nightmare?
Oh, for sure. There are plenty of those stories. So let's say there was a company rolling out a huge IoT deployment. Maybe it was digital signage or a fleet of kiosks across the country. On paper, a private APN sounded perfect. You get all these devices on a dedicated lane, you control all the traffic, and you keep it all nice and isolated. But then they started running into issues. As they scaled up, they had overlapping IP ranges, ended up with a ton of NAT complexity. Some devices couldn't reach others because of conflicting subnets, and every time they added a new region, they had to rejig the address plan. Troubleshooting became a nightmare because if something went down, you were digging through layers of NAT and tunnels just to figure out where the packets were getting lost. So what looked super neat and tidy on paper turned into a big operational headache when they tried to scale it. And that's where something like SASE or ZTNA, which doesn't rely on all that rigid addressing, can make life a lot easier.
All right, so that's the old world. Give me the one sentence difference between private APN and ZTNA and SASE.
Absolutely. In one sentence, a private APN is like having a dedicated private lane that always takes your data back to your own network, while ZTNA and SASE are about giving each user or device a smart key that lets them securely reach just the apps and resources they need from anywhere.
How does life change for the network team?
Well, life for the network team honestly gets a bit more flexible and a lot less tied down to all those static network rules. Instead of wrestling with private lanes, fixed IPs, and overlapping address plans, they start focusing more on identity-based policies. They set rules based on who or what is connecting rather than where it's connecting from. So in a nutshell, they get to step away from managing a bunch of rigid network calming and move toward a more dynamic cloud-friendly approach. It means less time spent troubleshooting NAT issues and more time refining access policies. In short, it's a shift from babysitting network infrastructure to actually focusing on who needs secure access and when.
Cool. How about the security team? How does life change for them?
Yeah, absolutely. For the security team, it's a pretty big shift in a good way. Instead of being locked into these static network-centric controls, they move toward an identity-driven approach. So instead of worrying so much about which IP address is allowed, they get to focus on who the user is, what device posture looks like, and what applications they should actually access. In other words, life for the security team gets a lot more about defining smart policies that follow the user rather than babysitting a bunch of network parameters. And that usually means better visibility and a more adaptive security posture overall. So it's kind of a win for them too.
All right, let's do the final one here. How about the team shipping the devices, the product team that ships the actual edge devices?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about them. For the team actually shipping out those edge devices, the shift to something like ZTNA or SASE can really simplify their lives. Instead of having to pre-configure every single device with a specific SIM tied to a private APN, they get to be a little more flexible. They can ship devices that just need an internet connection and then rely on identity-based onboarding rather than a bunch of complex network provisioning. So in short, the product team that's shipping these devices ends up dealing with fewer logistical headaches. They get more of a plug-and-play model where the security follows the device rather than having to wire everything into a private network from day one. So it just smooths out that whole deployment process.
Very cool. What does ZTNA give you in terms of posture checking that an APN just could never have touched?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the big things ZTNA really brings to the table is that it can look at device posture in real time. In other words, it can check if a device has the right security settings, if it's got the latest patches, if the antivirus is up to date, and all that good stuff before it ever grants access. And that's something a private APN just can't do because an APN is really just about right, exactly. So what ZTNA gives you is that dynamic layer of security that says, hey, it's not just about where you're connecting from, it's about whether your device is in a healthy state. And that's a game changer. You get to say, if you're not patched or you don't meet our security standards, you don't get in, no matter what network you're on. And that's something an APN was never designed to handle. So you just get that extra layer of confidence and security that's a lot more adaptive.
So most people listening today, they already have an APN and a bunch of SIMs out there. Let's talk about the reality of a migration here.
Absolutely. Let's get real about it. So if you've already got an APN and a whole fleet of ends out there, migrating isn't something you flip on overnight. It's more of a phased approach. You start by layering ZTNA or SASE on top of what you've got, kind of as an overlay. That way you're not ripping out the APN right away. You're just adding a new layer of security and identity-based access. Over time, you start moving devices off the old APN dependency, maybe starting with new deployments or less critical segments first. You phase it in, test it out, and gradually shift your policy management away from IP-based rules to identity-based rules. Eventually, you get to a point where the APN is more of a fallback or just a basic underlay, and your main security is all about who's connecting and what their posture is. So it's a journey, not a sprint, but it definitely pays off in terms of flexibility and security in the long run.
So what's the most common pattern you've seen in terms of APN as the underlay, SASE as the overlay, and how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. The most common pattern is really that you start by keeping the APN as your basic connectivity layer. It's the underlay, so it's still there to provide that initial network link. But on top of that, you start layering SASE or ZTNA as the overlay. That means all the actual security policies, user authentication, and device posture checks happen at that overlay level. So what you get is a scenario where the APN is just kind of a transport layer. It's there to get you online, but all the real intelligence and security happens in the overlay. You might gradually move devices off the old APN-centric model as you go, but at the start, it's really about using the APN as a bridge and letting the overlay handle all the smart stuff. It's a pretty smooth and proven way to do it, and it means you don't have to upend everything at once.
If I'm inheriting a big private APN deployment, what's the first 3 steps you'd recommend before touching anything?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're inheriting a big private APN deployment, the first 3 steps I recommend before you touch anything are these. First, map out what you have. Take stock of all the devices, the IP ranges, the critical applications that rely on that APN, and just get a clear picture of what you're dealing with. You want to know the lay of the land before you make any moves. Second, identify the low-risk segments. Find a part of your deployment that's less critical, or maybe it's a smaller set of devices that you can use as a test case. Then you can experiment with layering on ZTNA or SASE without risking your entire network. And third, set up a pilot. Put that low-risk segment on a pilot program where you test out the overlay approach, see how it works, refine your policies, and get comfortable with the new setup on a small scale. Once that's running smoothly, you can start thinking about scaling it up. But to basically know what you have, start small, and then pilot before you go big.
Can you walk through a before versus after story of maybe a fleet or a mobile where they went from APN centric to SASE plus ZTNA centric?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me paint a picture. Before the shift, you might have a fleet of devices, let's say a bunch of mobile kiosks or a large fleet of service vehicles, all relying on a private APN. Everything was tied back to the same central network. They had static IPs, and all the traffic had to route back to the enterprise data center. It worked, but it meant that anytime you needed to change policies or add new devices, you had to deal with all that network overhead. After the shift, they layered on SASE and ZTNA. Now the APN was still there as a transport, but all the security and access decisions were made at the overlay layer. So instead of funneling all traffic back to one place, each device could connect securely from anywhere. I started using identity-based policies, so only devices that met security standards could access certain applications, and that meant they could be a lot more agile. They didn't have to rely on those old static rule, and they got better visibility into device posture. In the end, the fleet was more flexible, the network team spent less time on NAT issues and more time on actually managing who gets access, and the business just had a much smoother, more secure way of doing things. So that's a pretty classic before and after story.
All right, so we've been pretty hard on APNs, but tell me a little bit more about where do APNs shine?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's fair. So APNs definitely still have their place. Where they shine is in scenarios where you need a really stable, predictable private lane that's easy to manage and where you want everything to come back to a central network. For example, in certain IoT deployments, like a set of sensors or kiosks that all need to talk back to a single data center and you don't need a lot of dynamic access rules, an APN can be a simple, straightforward solution. It's kind of a set it and forget it approach. Once it's in place, it's a known quantity, and you've got that private network bubble that you control end to end. So really, APNs are great when you need that kind of stable, centralized connectivity for specific use cases. They're not obsolete, they're just a bit more rigid compared to the flexibility you get with SASE and ZTNA. But in the right situations, they can still be a solid choice.
How about encryption in the private APN and IPsec, anything like that?
Yeah, definitely. So private APNs can also leverage encryption technologies like IPsec if you want to add that layer of security. Basically, you can set up tunnels between the mobile network and your data center to encrypt traffic end to end. That's definitely something APNs can do if you need that additional layer of confidentiality. Of course, with SASE and ZTNA, you're often getting encryption as part of the package, especially since you're dealing with identity-based tunnels and cloud security edges. But the point is, APNs do have options for encryption and can be secured pretty robustly. We'll just do it in a more network-centric way rather than the identity-driven approach you see with ZTNA. So yeah, they've got their strengths there too.
So if you were starting from scratch, designing a brand new connected product in 2025, no legacy, how'd you stitch it together?
Yeah, that's a great scenario to think about. If you're starting totally fresh in 2025 with no legacy at all, I definitely lean into a modern flexible architecture. So I'd start with a zero trust mindset from the beginning. That means focusing on identity-based access rather than network parameters. You probably use a SASE platform right from the get-go, so your devices just need a basic internet connection and everything else is handled by the overlay. You'd set up policies that follow users and devices, do real-time posture checking, and keep everything encrypted and secure by default. In other words, you'd be building a connected product that's really ready for the future. No need to retrofit old APN modules. You just have a streamlined cloud-native approach where security is built in from day one. So it'd be a lot cleaner and a lot more adaptable right out of the gate.
Very cool. What would you refuse to do that you would have done 5 years ago?
Yeah, that's a fun question. I think one big thing is I'd refuse to rely solely on a network perimeter for security. 5 years ago, you might have said, let's just put everything behind a private APN and call it a day. But now I'd refuse to do that. I'd say we're not going to trust just the network layer. We're going to assume that we need identity and zero trust principles from the start. I'd also refuse to ignore device posture. 5 years ago, maybe you'd let a device on the network just because it had the right SIM. Today, I'd say, no way. We're going to check if it's secure before it gets access. So in short, I'd refuse to rely on just a trusted network and instead build everything around identity, posture, and zero trust from the ground up.
3 to 5 years. What do you think the APN even means? Does it quietly become just an underlay people ignore?
Yeah, that's a great look ahead. I do think in 3 to 5 years, EAPN is probably going to fade more into the background. It'll still be there as an underlay, but yeah, it'll be something that people just kind of quietly rely on rather than talk about. The real focus is going to be on these overlay architectures that handle identity and security in a much more dynamic way. So the APN won't disappear, but it'll be more of a utility layer that you don't really have to think about much, while all the interesting stuff happens at the SASE and ZTNA level. So yeah, it kind of becomes that quiet underlay that just keeps things running.
All right, spicy take. What's the most overrated thing about private APNs and the most underrated things about SASE?
All right, let's get a little spicy with it. I'd say the most overrated thing about private APNs is the idea that they're a silver bullet for security just because they're private. There's this old notion that if it's on a private lane, it must be safe, but in reality, that can lead to a false sense of security. Just being on a private network doesn't automatically mean you're fully protected. So that's a bit overrated. As for the most underrated thing about SASE, it's the flexibility it gives you. People talk a lot about security and identity, but the real secret weapon is how adaptable it is. You can pivot quickly, you can onboard any devices easily, and you're not locked into rigid network rules. That adaptability is a huge underrated perk.
Love it, love it. All right, so someone takes away this conversation and goes to work tomorrow. What's one question you'd have them bring into their next meeting?
Yeah, absolutely. If there's one question to bring into that next meeting, I'd say it's this. Are we relying on our network just because it's familiar, or are we actually building for the flexibility and security we need in the future? Basically, challenge the status quo. Ask if you're sticking with old models out of habit, or if you're really ready to embrace the new approach. That question can open up a lot of good conversations and get people thinking about what really makes sense going forward.
This has been a fantastic conversation, Alex. My mind is blown. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure. I'm really glad you enjoyed it, and I hope it gave you some fresh ideas to run with. Thanks for having me on, and feel free to toss more questions my way anytime.
Bye, everybody.